Now let's talk about that devastation caused by the recent floods in KwaZulu-Natal. Is it a demonstration that the country is not moving fast enough to adopt appropriate urban planning? Because many areas lack proper drainage systems and informal settlements are often situated in flood-prone areas. Now, this urban sprawl into vulnerable areas without sufficient infrastructure to manage those heavy rains, one could imagine, significantly increases flooding risk. Let's ask Professor Guy Midgley, who is acting director at the School for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch University. Professor Guy, thank you so much for the time. Professor Guy Midgley joining us now. Let's just talk about whether this really is a sign then that we aren't moving enough or moving quick enough, shall I say, then to adopt appropriate urban planning. Is that the big problem?
It's definitely part of the problem. Thanks for having me, by the way. And, you know, I've got to express sympathy for people struggling and the loss of life. It's incredibly sad. It's definitely part of the problem, but our bigger challenge, which goes along with this, is the impacts of climate change, which have warmed the Indian Ocean and is now making these sorts of events much more, potentially more frequent, more intense, and are stretching our infrastructure. Even well-developed infrastructure is going to be stretched by these things. This is actually, I would say, is an emergency now, because we're seeing such a fast return of such conditions after a couple of years. And we really run the risk of seeing our urban settlements and even formal settlements degrading because of climate change. So we've got to do some thinking and acting very quickly.
How do we act very quickly? When something has happened in 2022, you have a similar issue less than 3 years later, ultimately. In that 3-year time span, to try and fix all that infrastructure, I mean, one can definitely say it's very difficult to do. How do we fix it?
Well, I think there are two main issues. One is around the capacity for planning and implementation, and there's plenty of that. We have excellent universities in the region and throughout the country and we have national institutions with the capacity to do the kind of planning that's required. The other element is the spending required from central fiscus, which is an absolute no-brainer. This should be done because we could create employment and create jobs through recovery and better recovery. And that investment from Central Treasury will more than pay South Africans back in the form of safer and more secure livelihoods and a longer-term prospect for sustainable lives. So it makes absolutely no sense that we have so many unemployed people when we could be employing a lot of people in this sort of recovery and better implementation of our cities and our settlements. And we have all the, we've got all the elements to put together, but nobody's putting it together.
Yeah, and it feels as though, despite us knowing all of this, these are the issues that have been known for quite some time then. Do you think it's just an issue of political will?
Well, I think government feels that it doesn't have the power to do so. It doesn't have the fiscal resources. But that's not true. We are a sovereign country. We create our own resources. We print our own money. We don't have to borrow money from anybody to do this. Our economy is clearly under-resourced in terms of fiscal resources. That's why we've got so much unemployment. So if we could spend more into the economy in useful areas like climate resilience, we could employ people and generate GDP to create the tax returns on that sort of investment. As long as, of course, is that the spending is controlled and goes to the right places. Obviously, people are afraid about that given the recent track record of such expenditures. So I can see why there's worry about it, but this is a question of survival.
Yeah.
And we've got to move, man. We're running out of time now.
I mean, the president has been making pleas and cries to ultimately the world here to say to them, look, the impact of climate change on countries like South Africa and the global south is far greater than the people that have ultimately caused it to be at the state it currently is at. Is this the right way to go, to be asking the world ultimately to help? I mean, you've just said we don't need to be borrowing money in order to get something like this done, but we have the president ultimately, I'm not going to say standing out with a begging bowl, but really pleading with the rest of the world to be a part of the solution.
I don't think we need any external resources. We've got all the expertise in the country. We've got excellent institutions, and we're fiscally a sovereign country. We don't need to borrow money from the World Bank and pay dollars back at exorbitant rates when the rand drops in value. That's suicidal. It's not required. We don't need. Obviously, we always want to work with the international community, but we don't have to feel dependent in any way. Yeah. We're a very powerful country, but we're just not using our freedom. We're not using our fiscal sovereignty, and we're not using the resources. We're just ignoring incredible human resources that we have, and a heck of a lot of unemployed people who would, I'm sure, be excellent in with some training to fill these gaps.
Are we failing at early warning?
No, not at all. I think that's an area where we're strong. Investment by the fiscus into South African weather services pays itself back probably at about 5 rand to every rand invested. So it's a no-brainer to invest in weather services because it just comes back into the economy as benefits. It pays itself back more than 1-to-1, much more than 1-to-1. So no, and we've got really good people. Weather services is pretty good. Our problem now is that the international community, because of the American shift in position, is starting to take a lot of these capacities offline and defund some of the critical global weather services that help us make these predictions well in advance. I'm extremely worried by the tendencies that are currently going on, and I don't know who's going to step into the breach, but it's very worrying. So we need to even further then bolster our own weather services so we can look after ourselves.
Yeah, you make a point that I think was very critical to make note of there as well, that the funding of all of these things, while we may necessarily, as you said, need to do it ourselves, defunding some of these by the likes of the United States especially is going to be very critical. What about language? And I say that directly to areas like KZN, like KwaZulu-Natal, like Cape Town, for example, the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape. Is language fair in the way we use it to warn people, to make them understand things? Are we perhaps using jargon? Is it not perhaps sent out in the right language for those particular areas? Are those not perhaps issues that we also need to consider in just how we tell people?
Well, there's just about no countries that do this that well. Probably one of the best is Cuba, actually, who've lost very, very few people. If you look at the islands around Cuba, who've lost lots of people in hurricanes. Cuba has hardly lost anybody. It's because culturally they're quite, uniform and quite authoritarian in a way. So they're able to, people understand the language very, very easily. In a very diverse country like ours, it's much more of a challenge. And it's not something I know a lot about. I think our social scientists really have to step up to the plate to help us a lot more here. It's a very practical issue. And it does need a lot of work, how to get the messages across. But more importantly, we shouldn't really be so vulnerable to these extreme events. Our infrastructure, our way of developing should be more resilient. I think we've developed in ways that make us extremely vulnerable. And that's where investment and planning and proper consideration needs to come into action. And the Climate Change Act also gives the government some leverage here. So as I say, this really is an emergency. It used to be a slow motion emergency, but it's now upon us. And you can see the Indian Ocean is warmer than average, and it's feeding all this hot, moist air into together with all these cyclones that are tracking.
Prof,
we've got problems.
Prof, let me interject very quickly. I mean, it's elements like orange level 5 that honestly, this year and perhaps in 2022 were the only times we had ever heard of those. So it's the education in and around this. Should we be doing that a little bit more, educating people on what these levels mean?
Yeah, it's quite a complicated scale. So the orange and the 5, one means how certain it is, the other means how intense it is. Yeah, that's very complicated. It's great for certain levels of government, for institutions that understand that code, but it's not you can't really decode it for ordinary people.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've got to find different languages there, but we've got a lot of social scientists who should be coming to the party here.
Yeah,
I'm sure they are.
Fully agree.
So that's
just as a final one, then, why are we so affected by these rains lately? I mean, one can remember if you go all the way back to 1998, I think it was, we had floods out of Mozambique, which caused mass casualties as well. Families having to ultimately even hide out in trees in some areas as well back then. And it just seems to have moved as well, a little bit more south, and we're getting affected. Why? What is happening exactly? Is there a phenomena we need to be aware of?
Well, with global warming, these things do tend to move further south. So essentially the weather bands move away from the poles. Away from the equator towards the poles. And that brings weather conditions that used to be a bit further north for us, more to the south. But also the ocean is in a different state, and we don't know if it's ever going to really flip back into a cooler state, but it's in a warm state, and that juices up the climate and gives a lot of extra energy. You know, there were 5 hurricanes across the Pacific and the Indian this week. It's very rare. It's very rare. So anyway, it's just the tendency here implies that we'd better get our act together. Otherwise, we're going to get ourselves rained out because of these sorts of events.
Professor Guy Midgley, appreciate the time this afternoon. Thank you so much. The Acting Director at the School for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch University.